good evening and good afternoon to you all, from those down the road to the folks around the world. Welcome to the Oscars special. This isn't the actual Oscars. I mean, seriously, do you really think that this is backstage from the Oscars? No, this is just my general office. Anyway, this time it's my 2010 Lookback Part 2, looking back at the last 10 years worth of films, going through some of the Oscar winners, some of the highest grossing films of the decade, and some of the highest grossing films of each and every year, and looking back at how the film industry has really changed over the past 10 years. So without further ado, here is those comments. Whether you're a movie buff or a casual viewer or even a date night attendee, movies and films have been an integral part of people's lives. If you look at, the way in which society has moved in the past 10 years, you can see a sort of shift in the actors and directors in which are portrayed in these films and which give the direction of these films. If you take a look at the most recent winner of the Best Picture Award, Parasite, that was the first international film and first Korean film to win a Best Picture award. And also films such as 12 Years a Slave and Moonlight have had Black lives integral to the stories and to the shaping of the film industry. Both films that I've just mentioned were also sort of Best Picture winners in their respective years. You've got the sort of rise of more equality, starting especially for female actors who would like more pay or equal pay. Actresses like Jennifer Lawrence have been integral to voicing their opinions on the equality of actors and actresses in terms of pay. And then you also have actors such as Chadwick Boseman, Michael B. Jordan, John Boyega, who's most notable for the Star Wars. Those three and many more have been almost, I wouldn't say allowed, but they've been given that amazing opportunity to star in Best Picture films and films that have been incredibly popular. So I think the way that the film industry has changed in the past 10 years has been integral to sort of how minorities and how people are viewed, and it is important that we sort of reflect movies and films to what real life is like, because if you have that unreflection or that notion of dissimilarity, then people aren't going to look up to certain actors or certain movies as sort of being integral to their lives, because as I said, movies are so integral to people's lives. They sort of almost shape people and their views and their sort of way in which they treat others, or that they feel they should be treated and how they should be respected. Another way in which movies have changed and sort of taken an about turn is this rise and sheer dominance of comic book movies. Things like Marvel and DC have become incredibly popular, making millions upon billions of dollars in revenue and ticket sales because of the popularity and the sort of escapism that they have. Martin Scorsese dismisses all of these comic book movies as theme park attractions, that they're not real movies. But a lot of people, myself included, would disagree with that statement, because comic book movies are just a different genre, a new sort of, yes, they might be sort of all singing, all dancing, and big action, large explosions and action, but it's just a new and different form of cinema where, horror and thriller and other actiony potentially movies have once been the norm. That's not to say that the comic book movies shouldn't be there, because they're just a different genre. A lot of classic films have, yes, they have been this sort of more preferred genre of film. But again, with this changing society and, people looking up to these heroes, these superheroes in these Marvel and comic book movies, they have their own right, and they do have their own right to be its own genre of film. The highest grossing franchises of the 2010s have been from comic book movies. The Marvel Cinematic Universe, as it is called, is number 1 on that list. Fourth on the list is the Avengers, which is also technically part of that Marvel universe, but they have, in their own right, gained enough popularity on their own as its own entity to become the 4th most popular franchise of the decade. And in fact, all 4 Avengers films are in the top 10 highest grossing movies of the decade. Avengers Endgame from 2019 stationed at number 1. Number 3 was 2018's Infinity War. Number 6 was the original Avengers back in 2012, and number 8 was the sequel, number 2, Avengers Age of Ultron in 2015. Among the other sort of highest grossing franchises, you've got Spider-Man, who had seen success in the early 2000s with Tobey Maguire, and then later Andrew Garfield in 2012 and then 2014, before taking a shift over to the Marvel mainstay and Marvel universe with Tom Holland. And then you also have franchises like the X-Men, who are also technically part of that Marvel company, but are owned by 20th Century Fox and have their own entity of films. The X-Men films have been around since 1999 and have been very popular sort of in the decade before the last. But in this decade, with this sort of rise in popularity, they've gained more traction with films such as X-Men First Class and the subsequent sequels that followed. Even 2017's Logan, which was one of the first R-rated comic book movies to hit the screens, was immensely popular. Deadpool, even, another two films that were R-rated and technically huge in terms of dominating success. Comic book movies shouldn't be taken for granted, and companies like DC have tried to incorporate their own sort of cinematic universe to latch on to this sort of success of Marvel, but have failed in some respect. They might have gotten, the big dollars, the big money, but in terms of, sort of character-driven and, film popularity, they just simply haven't gained enough traction and enough popularity to sort of become on the bandwagon of this comic book success. The only exception I can think of is 2017's Wonder Woman, which, going back to the whole diversity and integration into movies, Wonder Woman was sort of this movie that no one really expected to be popular, but because it was sort of a female lead and a strong female and an amazing character that people could look up to, that is what made it popular. That is why comic book characters and comic book films are popular in today's age, because kids of a young age can look up to these characters, male or female, and, you know, I wouldn't say live by their standards, because obviously they're fictional, they're superheroes, they're sort of otherworldly, but they can look up to these characters and feel a sense of wonder and a sense of escapism from certainly the pressures of this entire, well, the last decade. Now, Disney, it's a big franchise. It owns Marvel. It took over the Marvel company back in the early part of the last decade. It has also taken over the Star Wars franchise, releasing episode number 7 back in 2015. It became a sort of a sensation because obviously the last time Star Wars had seen a movie was back in 2007 with episode 3. Star Wars episode 7, because remember, you got to think sequels, prequels, and then this time around. 2015's The Force Awakens episode 7 was 5 times Oscar nominated, but only in the editing categories. And it gained the popularity for being the second highest grossing movie of the last decade. It was glitzy, it was glamorous, it was Star Wars. You know, people for 40 odd years have been loving Star Wars since the original back in 1977. The prequels from in the early 2000s were respectable. I like them. They were respectable but not necessarily loved. Mainly because of the infamous character of Jar Jar Binks being really quite annoying. But Star Wars this time around, because it's now owned by Disney, has sort of somewhat fallen flat in terms of popularity. There's lots of TV shows coming out now, The Mandalorian with Baby Yoda, which everybody seems to love. You've also got an Obi-Wan centric TV show coming out on the streaming service Disney Plus. You've also got other films such as Rogue One, a Star Wars story, which came out in 2017, I want to say, and you know, a couple of other sort of spin-offs to the Star Wars franchise. People have somewhat been overloaded by Star Wars, and when the 8th episode came out back in 2017, it may have been the highest grossing film of that year, but a lot of critics were keen to latch on to the fact that it wasn't a good film. You know, a lot of what happened in that film probably could have, in my opinion, probably could have been wrapped up in about half an hour. And then the redeeming factor in 2019, Star Wars Episode 9, redeemed the franchise in many respects, but again, a lot of critics didn't enjoy it as much as, say, the originals or the prequels. Again, it's sort of this Disney effect, you know, this bombardment of sort of movies and over subscription to sort of films. I mean, even the likes of, you know, The Lion King and Aladdin, these sort of live action remakes to Disney classics, have somewhat fallen flat in terms of popularity. That being said, The Lion King is number 5 in one of the highest grossing movies of the decade, but I think that's because people were intrigued and people knew the popularity of the original back in the 90s, but when it came to actually watching the film and when it came to viewing the film and basing an opinion on it, it wasn't critically well received. But now on to the main event, which is the Oscars. Now, the Oscars don't always conform to populism. They don't always nominate or recognise the popularity of certain films. So films like the Avengers or Star Wars or other big sort of franchise films haven't necessarily been nominated for the top awards at the Oscars. That being said, when they do get nominated, it is usually for editing or the production values. Black Panther, however, bucks that trend. It was Oscar nominated in 2019. It didn't win the Best Picture nomination, but it did come away with 3 other Oscars in its process. Again, it all comes back down to sort of this diversity and integration of black characters and black storytelling. Green Book, I mean, the film that won Best Picture for 2019 was another prime example of this case. So it has been that over the past sort of, I don't know, 3, 4, maybe 5 years, that's really sort of changed in sort of the Oscar nominations and how the Oscars have been viewed. Back in 2017, the 89th Oscars, there was a big catastrophe, a big sort of controversy, a mix-up in the who won the Best Picture award. The Best Picture award is the sort of final night award that people get. The biggest film, the best film of the year would get. It was announced that La La Land had won. And we all know how that turned out, because it wasn't La La Land that won, it was the film Moonlight, which again is another one of these sort of Black Lives Matter films that, you know, was recognised by the film industry, by the Oscars, as being of the best film of that year. La La Land got 6 awards, so, you know, it didn't matter too much, but the whole point of this controversy was, you know, somebody had opened the letter up and it was wrong. Oops, never mind. And I think it's interesting also to note that The Artist, back in 2012, which won Best Picture and 4 other awards, was the first one of the first silent movies since the 20s to win an Oscar, and was again another one of the first black and white pictures since the again sort of the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s. It's sort of a big sensation, you know, The Artist. None of these films I've actually seen. None of the Oscar-winning films have I actually seen, because I feel that they're a bit too artistic for my taste. I just go for, one would say, the more popular stuff, but I do have a little bit more integrity than that. The Oscars are an interesting occasion. I just thought I'd talk about them. That being said, that is the end of this video, this issue. I hope that I have, you know, given an interesting sort of perspective and look at, in sort of a close confines of how the how the film industry has changed over the past 10 years, and that the movie industry has come in leaps and bounds since the humble beginnings of the beginning of the last decade. So, if you've liked this video, please do click the like button. Also, please do subscribe to it, because that also helps me greatly. Make a comment on any of the films that you thought, either for this year or any other year in the past 10 years, that you have seen that deserves more recognition than had previously been given to it. Mine is John Carter. I think John Carter is a brilliant film, but it is apparently not very good in terms of critical acclaim and popularity. So yeah, put a comment in the below. All of my links, such as Instagram, Facebook, and my page, are in the links description below. And I will see you next week for another hopefully good video. Thank you.